They were told not to expect mercy. They were told they were fighting a war that wasn't theirs to fight. They were told by their own country that they weren't soldiers, not really just men in uniform who would never be heroes. And then on a cold April morning in 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled around them, a unit of black soldiers from the United States Army walked through the gates of Stalag VII-A near Moosburg, Germany, and discovered something that would change them forever. They discovered the true face of evil. They discovered what they had been fighting against all along. And they discovered something about themselves that no amount of segregation, no amount of racism, no amount of hatred from their own nation could ever diminish. Private James Mitchell was 23 years old. He came from Mobile, Alabama, where his grandfather had been enslaved, where his father had lived under Jim Crow, where his own childhood had been shaped by the knowledge that his skin color determined his worth in the eyes of the law. He had joined the Army not because he loved America, but because his country was at war, and because sometimes you have to love something enough to fight for what it could be, even if it breaks your heart over what it actually is. He was part of the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion, an all-black unit that had spent months clearing roads, building bridges, and fighting alongside white units whose officers made sure they understood that their lives were less valuable. They were engineers first, soldiers second, and black men always. The 183rd had pushed through France. They had crossed the Rhine. They had fought through the devastation of a continent burning under Nazi occupation, and somewhere in the fog of a war that seemed endless, they had received orders to move toward Moosburg, a small Bavarian town where rumors suggested that American prisoners of war were being held. The Army didn't expect the black engineers to find anything significant. They were there to clear the roads, to remove obstacles, to do the work that white soldiers didn't want to do. But what Private Mitchell and his brothers found would be the most significant discovery of their lives. The camp emerged from the morning mist like something from a nightmare that the world hadn't yet learned to speak about. Stalag VII-A had held over 70,000 prisoners during the war. Soviet soldiers, British soldiers, American soldiers, French soldiers, Italian soldiers, Polish soldiers, men from across Europe, stripped of rank, stripped of dignity, stripped of humanity. The Germans had deliberately mixed them together, forcing them to compete for scarce food, for space to sleep, for the basic dignity of being treated like human beings. By April 1945, with the war in its final weeks, the camp had descended into something beyond description. Disease ravaged the prisoners. Starvation had become the norm. And the German guards, knowing that defeat was imminent, had largely abandoned the camp. Private Mitchell didn't understand what he was seeing at first. His mind couldn't process it. The skeletal figures moving through the compound weren't quite human anymore. They were ghosts that somehow maintained animation, men whose bodies had been hollowed out by months or years of systematic deprivation. Some couldn't walk, some couldn't see, some couldn't speak. Some were too broken to even understand that liberation had finally arrived. The stench of disease and death and human waste hung in the air like a physical presence. Bodies lay in rows where they had been left, men who had simply given up, who had lost the will to live in a place where survival itself had become an act of rebellion. For the first time in his life, Private Mitchell understood what he had been fighting for. Not for America, though his blood and sweat had been spilled on European soil in service to his country. Not for justice, though he had lived his entire life under a system designed to make him believe he didn't deserve it. He had been fighting for this. For the ability to look evil in the face and say no. For the opportunity to save lives from men who had decided that some people didn't deserve to live. He'd been fighting for the moment when a black man from Alabama, a man whose own country had denied him basic rights, could open the gates and let these tortured men know that they were going to live. The prisoners didn't believe it at first. They had been lied to before. The Germans had promised them food that never came. They had been told that liberation was near when they were still thousands of miles from salvation. When American soldiers arrived, the prisoners' first instinct wasn't joy. It was suspicion. Because hope is a luxury that only survives if you believe the world is fundamentally just, and these men had learned that the world is fundamentally not just. They had learned it in the systematic horror of Nazi imprisonment. They didn't know that the men freeing them were themselves experiencing a kind of liberation, a moment when the racism of their own military command would be momentarily irrelevant in the face of something so enormous that it required every human being to rise to the occasion. Captain Robert Whitfield was the commanding officer of the unit, a white officer from Ohio who had come to respect his black soldiers in ways that most of the Army never would. He stood at the gate of the camp and wept, not from compassion alone, though he felt that. He wept because he understood that nothing in his life had prepared him for this. Nothing that he had learned about warfare, about strategy, about the nature of conflict. had prepared him for the reality of what industrialized evil looked like when you walked through the gate and saw it firsthand. The camp was more than a prison. It was a machine designed to destroy the human spirit. It had taken men, thousands of men, and systematically dismantled everything that made them human, stripped it away piece by piece until nothing remained but breathing corpses waiting to die. The first thing the soldiers did was give the prisoners food, hot food, real food, the kind of rations that American soldiers ate that the prisoners had dreamed of in the dark of their barracks. Many of them couldn't eat. Their stomachs had shrunk so much during months of starvation that food was almost poison to their bodies. Some of them wept. Some of them couldn't stop eating, couldn't accept that food would keep coming, that they weren't going to be starved to death tomorrow. The black soldiers watched this with an understanding that their white brothers couldn't quite share, because many of them had grown up poor. Many of them had known hunger, not the industrial-scale starvation of the camps, but the everyday hunger of people deemed less worthy of resources. They understood, in a way that many people never would, that hunger is a weapon, that food is freedom. Private Mitchell was assigned to help move the surviving prisoners to a medical tent. He would never forget the weight of the man he carried. Nothing. The man weighed almost nothing. It was like carrying a skeleton wrapped in skin. The man's eyes looked up at him with an expression that Mitchell couldn't quite identify. It took him a moment to realize what it was. It was gratitude. It was the gratitude of someone who had believed they were going to die in that place and suddenly discovered that they would live. It was the gratitude of someone who had been treated like less than human finally being treated with dignity. As the army medics moved through the camp, the true scope of the Nazi atrocity began to emerge. There were records. The Germans, meticulous in their documentation of genocide, had kept careful records of who had died, how they had died, when they had died. There were bodies in mass graves. There were bodies in hospital barracks that had become death chambers. There were systematic notations of men who had been executed, men who had died of disease, men who had been deliberately worked to death. The numbers were incomprehensible. Thousands. Thousands of men murdered systematically by a regime that had decided that certain people didn't deserve to live. But Stalag VII-A was not an extermination camp in the way that camps like Auschwitz or Treblinka were. Those camps, with their gas chambers and crematoria, represented the industrial-scale genocide that the Nazis had industrialized as part of their plan to create a pure Aryan race. Stalag VII-A was different. It was a place where prisoners of war were worked to death, where they were starved, where they were tortured. But it wasn't primarily designed as a death factory. It was a concentration camp, a place where human beings were concentrated and systematically degraded. And yet the horror was total. The degradation was complete. What struck Private Mitchell most forcefully was the variety of suffering, because Stalag VII-A held not just soldiers but political prisoners. It held Jews who had survived the concentration camps and had then been recaptured. It held Soviet prisoners who had been treated with particular cruelty because the Nazis viewed Slavic peoples as subhuman. It held Italian soldiers who had been brutalized when Italy switched sides. It held French resistance fighters. It held Polish civilians. It held men from across the continent who had committed the crime of opposing Nazi rule or being born into the wrong religion or the wrong ethnicity. And for the first time, the black soldiers of the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion understood what racism looked like when it was allowed to reach its logical conclusion. They understood viscerally and completely what happened when you built a political system on the premise that some people didn't deserve rights, that some lives didn't matter, that the law didn't apply to everyone equally. They saw the result. They saw it in the bodies of the dead. They saw it in the hollow eyes of the survivors. They saw it in the meticulous German records that documented the systematic murder of human beings as though it were just another military operation. For many of the black soldiers, there was a moment of profound recognition. They had lived their entire lives in a nation that had told them they were inferior. They had been segregated by law. They had been denied basic rights. They had been treated as less worthy of dignity and respect. And now they were looking at what happened when a nation took those principles to their logical extreme. When racism stopped being a system of social control and became a system of genocide. They understood something that much of America would take decades to comprehend, that racism, left unchecked, inevitably leads to atrocity. Private Mitchell helped carry a Soviet soldier out of one of the barracks. The man was barely alive. He'd been in the camp for 3 years. 3 years of starvation, 3 years of beatings, 3 years of watching his comrades die. He looked at Mitchell, looked at the black skin of the man who was saving his life, and asked in broken English a single question. Why? Why are you helping me? Why do you care? Why are you risking anything for a stranger? And Private Mitchell didn't have a simple answer. He could have talked about duty. He could have talked about the principles he was fighting for. But what he said instead was simpler and more true. Because you're human. Because nobody should die in this place. Because I can't live with myself, I don't try. The German guards, when they were found, were arrested by the American soldiers. Most of them tried to claim that they were just following orders, that they hadn't wanted to participate in the brutality, that they had done what they had to do to survive. They talked about the chain of command. They talked about Nazi ideology being forced upon them. They talked about circumstances beyond their control. And the black soldiers listened to these excuses with a kind of bitter understanding, because they had heard similar arguments before. They had heard their own nation use similar logic to justify segregation. They had heard white Americans claim that the system of Jim Crow wasn't their doing, that they were just following the rules of society, that circumstances had placed them in positions they hadn't chosen. The difference was the scale. The difference was that one system had been codified into law and social custom while the other had been industrialized into genocide, but the logic was the same. The willingness to treat people as less than human was the same. The ability to dehumanize, to create psychological distance between yourself and the people you were harming was the same. The soldiers realized with horror that the Holocaust wasn't something that had emerged from some alien evil, some incomprehensible darkness that had nothing to do with the rest of the world. It was what happened when racism became the law of the land. It was what happened when a nation decided that some people's lives didn't matter. In the weeks after Stalag VII-A was liberated, the reality of what the Allied forces had uncovered began to spread. Photographs were taken. Journalists arrived. The world was slowly, painfully confronted with the reality of what had been happening in Europe. And for the first time, America began to grapple with a question that it had been avoiding. If we are fighting this war against Nazi racism and genocide, what does that say about our own racism at home? If we are liberating prisoners from a concentration camp, what does that say about our own system of segregation? If black soldiers are giving their lives to stop genocide in Europe, how can we continue to deny them basic rights in Alabama? The answer, of course, was that America couldn't reconcile these contradictions, not for another 20 years anyway. The nation would try. It would celebrate the liberation of the camps while continuing to segregate its own armed forces. It would praise the black soldiers who had freed prisoners of the Nazis while continuing to deny those same soldiers the right to vote, the right to an education, the right to eat at the same table as white people. This contradiction wouldn't be resolved until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, until the generation of men who had liberated the camps had aged enough that their moral authority could no longer be ignored. But in April of 1945, in the immediate aftermath of liberation, something shifted in the hearts of the men who had walked through those gates. Private Mitchell would live for another 60 years. He would return to America, he would attend college, he would become a teacher, he would marry and have children and grandchildren, but he would never forget what he had seen in Stalag VII-A. He would never forget the faces of the men he had helped save. He would never forget the moment when he understood completely and irrevocably that racism was not just a personal prejudice or a social custom. It was the seed from which genocide grew. The other prisoners, the ones who survived, were gradually evacuated from the camp. Some were repatriated to their home countries. Some stayed in displaced persons camps while the world tried to figure out where they belonged in a Europe that had been devastated by war. Many of them never found their way home. Their families had been killed. Their countries had been destroyed. They had survived the Nazis only to lose everything else. But they had survived. Because of men like Private Mitchell, because of black soldiers who understood that liberating prisoners from a concentration camp was not complicated by the fact that they themselves had been denied freedom in their own country. Because sometimes human decency transcends politics. Sometimes duty transcends discrimination. The liberation of Stalag VII-A wasn't the most famous liberation of World War II. That distinction probably belongs to Dachau or Buchenwald or Auschwitz, camps whose horrors were so extreme that they became the iconic image of Nazi atrocity. But Stalag VII-A was significant for a different reason. It was a place where American soldiers, black American soldiers, came face to face with the logical endpoint of racism. It was a place where they could see, in stark and unmistakable terms, what their nation was potentially becoming if it continued down the road it was traveling. It was a place where they could understand, in a way that Americans who never set foot in Europe might not, that segregation and genocide were not separate evils but stages on the same continuum of dehumanization. When the soldiers returned home, most of them didn't talk much about what they had seen. The traumas of war are not icily spoken. The horrors of the Holocaust are not icily explained to people who have not witnessed them. Many of the men of the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion would spend decades processing what they had experienced. Many of them would never fully process it. But what they had seen in Stalag VII-A would inform how they lived their lives after the war. It would make them more determined to fight for civil rights. It would make them more resistant to the racism of their own nation. It would make them understand in a way that was bone deep and undeniable that what they were fighting against in Europe was intimately connected to what they were fighting against at home. The story of black soldiers liberating concentration camps is not widely known. It is not taught in most schools. It is not prominent in most histories of World War II, but it is a story that matters profoundly. It is a story about men who were denied basic rights by their own nation, but who still found the capacity to show mercy to strangers. It is a story about what happens when racism is allowed to reach its ultimate expression. It is a story about the resilience of the human spirit and the capacity for compassion that can exist even in the darkest moments. It is a story about the price of freedom and the cost of hatred. Private Mitchell lived to be 87 years old. He spent his final years telling the story of Stalag VII-A to students, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. He wanted people to understand what he had witnessed. He wanted the world to know that black soldiers had been there at the gates of the camps, that they had been among those who confronted Nazi evil firsthand, that they had played a role in liberating Europe from one of history's greatest tyrannies. He wanted people to understand that racism left unchecked becomes genocide. He wanted people to understand that the struggle for civil rights in America was not separate from the struggle against Nazism in Europe, but intimately connected to it. When the gates of Stalag VII-A swung open on that April morning in 1945, something profound happened. A moment of reckoning arrived. The black soldiers who had walked through those gates had been denied freedom in their own country, but they had the power to grant freedom to thousands of strangers. They chose to do so. They chose to show compassion. They chose to treat those prisoners with the dignity that had been denied them their entire lives. In that choice, they became something more than soldiers. They became witnesses to the worst that humanity could do. They became agents of liberation in the truest sense. They became men who had looked into the abyss and decided that they would not let it consume them, that they would not let evil have the final word. The camp was fully liberated by April 30th, 1945, just 1 week before Nazi Germany surrendered. The war in Europe would end on May 7th, 1945. The black soldiers of the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion would eventually return home. They would be greeted not as liberators, but as colored soldiers returning to a segregated nation. Many of them would struggle with what they had seen. Many of them would turn that struggle into activism, into a determination that the world they had fought for would be different from the world they had left behind. They would become the quiet heroes of the civil rights movement, men who understood, from their own direct experience of Nazi atrocity, that segregation was not just morally wrong, but existentially dangerous. The story of Stalag VII-A is not a story with a simple resolution. It is not a story where good defeats evil and everyone lives happily ever after. It is a story about the persistence of human decency in the face of systematic horror. It is a story about what it means to be human when inhumanity has become the law of the land. It is a story about black soldiers who risked everything to fight a war they had not started, in a nation that did not fully recognize their humanity, so that others might be free. And it is a story that demands to be remembered not because it has a happy ending, but because it tells us something essential about who we are and who we might become.